All right, everyone. We are here with Dylan DiNardo, the co-founder and CEO of Mindstate Design Labs. Dylan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me, Brom. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. You guys are working on some very interesting stuff that I think is different than what you see with most other psychedelic companies out there. Um, and I think that like a lot of people are going to be very interested in learning about, what Mindstate is up to and how you're approaching the whole idea of psychedelic mind states. But first, I think I like trying to figure out how people got into this space because everyone kind of always has like an interesting story. So maybe you could tell us like a little bit about Mindstate, but then also kind of cover like what your background was and what were you doing before Mindstate?
Sure, absolutely. Um, so my professional background is in biotech VC. I worked for the internal venture arm of a large nonprofit out on the East Coast of the US, big insurance company and hospital system, and invested in a pretty wide variety of life sciences companies, very late stage companies, very early stage companies, many different modalities, many different disease indications, a bit of a focus on things like gene therapy, oncology, cell therapy, but also med devices, health tech, really across the board there. So I played an investing role, also played an operational role where I would step in for a period of time in companies that were very early, spin out companies based on technology that was just ready to be commercialized. And so I'd help stand up the company and get the management team hired, get the company off the ground. So it was very meaningful work, and I really liked it. Working on things like trying to cure cancer and blindness and things that certainly make a big impact for patients. But my primary personal interest was in this area of mental health and psychedelics specifically. So if I put my VC hat on, life sciences markets, when you look across all the different areas here, mental health is by far the largest unmet need. It's the largest direct healthcare spending category, but even beyond that, the disease burden of mental health, as compared to the amount that we spend on it, is just enormous. But for me, it was a bit more personal. So I had been diagnosed in the past with PTSD, major depressive disorder, ADHD, and I was one of those. You'll hear many similar stories, people in the psychedelic space who were early adopters of psychedelic therapy as I was. And while I can't necessarily make the causative claim, I can say that at this point I haven't qualified on any of the scales for any of those disorders for many years. And so I saw firsthand the potential of these compounds and, more importantly, the experiences that were associated with different types of compounds and the way in which they addressed the root causes of various mental health disorders. And so that had been my interest for some time. I had waited for the space to just develop, the psychedelic space to develop to the point where things were commercializable, where I could marry my career and my passion and the great work done by many researchers, Rick Doblin, many of the ones who pushed forward this first generation of psychedelics just made that possible over the past few years. So Mindstate Design Labs then was born. So I think officially here in May of last year, May of 2021. So I teamed up with Tom Ray, who was previously a professor of computer science and biology at Oklahoma University. And Tom is one of these guys, just incredibly smart, one of these geniuses who has made seminal contributions to multiple fields of science. So he started out, he's an evolutionary biologist, started out his career in the jungle, and both of his first two publications, even when he was still an undergrad, were published in the journal Science. So one of the top scientific journals. I think that first publication was when he was an undergrad, but it was just both of those publications were about phenomena that he discovered while in a walk in the jungle. So he's a natural historian. If you think about people like Charles Darwin and Jane Goodall, these people who go out into complex nature and just look for patterns without assumptions, without hypotheses. They look for patterns that can then be reframed as hypotheses. And those hypotheses can then be subjected to the experimental scientific method. And so that is Tom's fundamental skill set. And that's what he applied first in the jungle. He then applied it to the field of artificial life. So he had no background in computer science whatsoever, but created his own CPU architecture and new machine code. He created the first instance of artificial life, the first instance of evolution by natural selection after life on Earth. And he succeeded in doing that where no one in the field had before. So again, it was this natural history approach of looking for patterns, looking at the space from an orthogonal perspective. And that's what he's now done in the field of psychedelics. So he spent the last 20 years studying, I would say, two broad sets of data. One set being biochemical data. So taking wide scale, broad receptor assays across a variety of qualitatively distinct psychedelics. He worked with Alexander Shulgin, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the father of psychedelics, created most psychedelic compounds that exist today. He worked with Shulgin to select compounds that were qualitatively diverse, that had qualitatively diverse experiences associated with them, and basically did a lot of analysis of the biochemistry of those drugs versus the experiential reports of those drugs that had been available. And so that led to a series of hypotheses around the role of different receptor targets in the psychedelic experience. And that formed the foundation of what turned into Mind State Design Labs. When I looked at the space from the drug development perspective, from the VC perspective, it was very clear to me that the experiential components of the therapies was central to the outcomes. Now you can have a more nuanced conversation about individual compounds where sometimes the fundamental biochemistry plays more of a role. Sometimes the psychological factors play more of a role, but as a general statement, I find that to be true. The problem is there is no translational model for altered states of consciousness. You can put these drugs in rodents, you can see a head twitch response. There are various animal models, but a rodent can't tell you what kind of ego loss you're going to then experience in humans. So what I saw in Tom's technology was the ability to create a predictive model for altered states of consciousness, for subjective psychedelic effects. And so that's how Mind State Design Labs was born.
So just to sort of like try to repeat what you just said back to you, the idea is basically you have this technology that you've built by taking all of Tom Ray's like receptor data and all these experiential reports, and you can basically say, if we want to create a state of mind that is like so and so, well, here's maybe the receptors that we need to hit in certain combinations, and that gives you sort of like at least an idea of what sort of compounds you might want to try engineering. Is that kind of the right way to think
Absolutely.
about it? Okay.
Yeah, that's the summary. And a lot of research in the space is focused on a particular subtype of serotonin receptor, so the 5-HT2A receptor, which certainly plays a very key role. But if you look at the quality of experience across different compounds, there are these consistent silos of experience. To take maybe one of the more striking examples, you can talk about DMT and N-dimethyltryptamine versus 5-MeO-DMT. So with DMT, you have these experiences where the patient enters sort of a dreamlike state. There's an encounter with an alternate reality. And this reality is often filled with intelligent entities. It's a landscape, very interesting type of experience. Then in contrast, I'd present 5-MeO-DMT, which is sort of your classical mystical experience and the introvert variety of the mystical experience. So unitive, oceanic boundlessness, often described as a void. So definitely not these factors of an alternative landscape populated by entities. And it's consistent. So you're never going to confuse one or the other. You'll never give a patient 5-MeO-DMT and have them encounter the entities. So there are clear differences in experience, and those have to be driven by biology. And so what we're doing is figuring out what are the interactions of 5-HT2A versus these other receptor targets that drive those differences.
Yeah, and I think that definitely does seem to be sort of the next phase of the psychedelics industry. I mean, even me, who's not a scientist, but who knows how to read Wikipedia articles, like it does seem like there is a massive overemphasis on 5-HT2A agonists and ignoring the interplay between that receptor and then the other 5-HT subtypes, and then all the other like non-serotonin receptors like NMDA, which is what ketamine agonizes, and like the kappa opioid, which is what salvia agonizes. It's like if you think about all the different possible combinations of those things, And if you think about the fact that those combinations are not necessarily linear, like it's not necessarily additive, it's like there's kind of this boundless universe of potential like states of consciousness or experiences that you could engineer, assuming that you're able to actually like, make the drugs that you want to make, I think that that's like a
Exactly.
very, very, it just makes me think that there are going to be so many more use cases for psychedelics than we currently understand, right? Because if you can create like totally new experiences, then maybe you can apply psychedelics to something that we have never even thought to apply them to, which I think is super cool. But what things is MindState going to be going after first? Is it the classic mental health indications or something else?
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to go for some of the relatively low-hanging fruit. Great work has been done with MDMA in the entactogenic state. Great work has been done with psilocybin and the ego loss or the oceanic boundlessness state. And so in order to prove out the discovery platform, the underlying approach, our initial products are going to be variations on some of these states where you've already seen proof of the connection between the mental state and the medical outcome. So our lead program, you can think of as a version of MDMA. It's actually not structurally related to MDMA. It's actually a combination of compounds that are designed to produce the entactogenic state of MDMA. So turning the amygdala off, reducing fear, providing overwhelming feelings of empathy and the ability to safely contemplate mental pain, what's known generally as the entactogenic state. So we're producing this state without the side effects of MDMA. And fundamentally, it's based on what we call the primer probe approach. So this is a combination molecule approach where you take one compound that hits 5-HT2A and then a second compound that hits some other target in the brain. That second compound would not itself be psychoactive and certainly not psychedelic. But when combined with that serotonergic primer, it modulates the nature of the psychedelic effect. And so we're first applying that approach to this entactogen.
Interesting. And so those secondary compounds are not necessarily psychoactive on their own, but in combination with the original psychedelic compound, it alters the experience. Is that kind of the right way to think about it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting because, when you read, these sort of like psychedelic forums on Reddit and stuff, you'll hear a lot of people talk about combining multiple psychedelic compounds together to get certain specific states, but you don't really see a lot of people talking about combining like one thing that's psychedelic and one thing that's not. I guess because it's very difficult unless you're like a neuroscientist or something to understand what those secondary chemicals should be unless you already have an idea of what their psychedelic state is like. So that's very
Yeah,
that's very
absolutely.
cool.
Yeah, in many ways, this combination approach is almost the natural approach. So if you think back to the indigenous societies who are using these things, it's often a combination of plants. If you look at underground recreational use, it's people trying combinations. And so to some extent, what we're doing is taking a similar approach, but doing it much more rigorously from a scientific perspective and breaking it down into its component parts.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense because ayahuasca, right? It's the vine that has the DMT in it, and then it's the vine that has the what is it, the 5-MAO inhibitor?
Yeah,
I forget
monoamine
what it's called.
oxidase
Yeah,
inhibitor. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that in itself is not psychoactive. You've got to wonder how they figured out that those two things together worked, huh? Very
Absolutely.
interesting.
Well, harmine and MAO inhibitors are somewhat psychoactive, I believe, by themselves, but certainly not psychedelic in the traditional sense. And you do have people who will say report on Arrowhead that they're combining, say, melatonin with a psychedelic. And
Mm.
melatonin is one of those things that is certainly not psychedelic, but does have a minor psychoactive effect. And when you do combine that with a serotonergic psychedelic, the effect can be very interesting. So you do see many examples of this already.
That makes sense. So, question, I don't know if you can go into the details or not, but like you talk about having this machine learning platform that can predict different types of states. Is there sort of a list of states or like experiences that you have sort of established? And can you kind of go into like what some of those states are? And are there any that are like maybe particularly surprising?
Yeah, I can certainly talk about that. So when we talk about states, a state is just the general collection of all the factors of cognition and mood. And so it's a bit of a loosely defined thing. Each state is then broken down to a series of what we call effects. And so an effect may be something like a visual effect, a certain type of visual hallucination. It may be a tactile effect. It may be an effect on mood, an effect on cognition, like the ego loosening. And so at this point, we have 400 or so different effects that are cataloged, where we have examples coming directly from human reports. And that list we do expect to grow substantially over time here. Turning those effects into states is a bit more of an involved process, being able to map which effects are associated with which states and to which degree of regularity. There are all these biochemical factors here, but there are many confounding factors in the data as well. There's inter-individual variability. There's variability within one particular person based on the set of the experience, the mindset, and the setting. And so teasing out those factors is more of a long-term thing. So when we talk about states, the examples I always give are that entactogenic state, because that's been very well defined, very well studied, and then the ego loss state, which is also fairly well defined and well studied, and for which we already have validated rating scales. One example here, if you're trying to talk about how do we go from where we are to other states, one very near-term example is talking about the introvertive versus the extrovertive mystical experience. So this is a distinction that's fairly well established in the literature. And the way you can think about it is that an extrovertive mystical experience, well, actually, let me back up. So both of these are unitive type experiences. So the technical term is this oceanic boundlessness effect, the loss of the belief that I am separate from that which is around me. And it can be kind of subdivided into two categories. The extrovertive category is, as it sounds, sort of outward facing. So it's more about a connection experience of all is one. So sort of the maybe the Lion King quote of the antelopes eat the grass. When we die, we become the grass. It's all connected. It's all this web. It's all this circle. And it's this very profound thing that's not just philosophical, but it's experiential. And you lose the underlying distinction from self and other, and it goes outward in all these connections. That is very distinct from the introverted mystical experience, which is, I guess, maybe similar to 5-MeO. It reminds me more of a Buddhist perspective, where it's an experience of nothingness. There is the void, there is the infinite, unitive nothingness. And it's also a very blissful experience, but it's kind of going within as opposed to going without. And so the difference between those two types of experiences, you can kind of draw the connections to different drugs. 5-MeO tends to produce more of the introvertive type. LSD tends to present probably both, maybe with a little bit more of a leaning toward the extrovertive type. But the distinctions between these two types of experiences may also have different therapeutic outcomes. So that's one example in which we're taking a particular type of state and trying to understand more fundamentally what is the biology that leads to these different types of experiences. Beyond that, there are many different states, some of which are possible within existing psychedelics, some of which may not be possible within existing psychedelics, because those single compounds, those monotherapies, just have a limited range of areas of the brain that they interact with. And so what's really exciting is beginning to explore this space of the universe of altered states of consciousness that are not possible within existing psychedelics.
Yeah, sign me up for the clinical trial. I mean, I want to try some new states. It's it's very, very interesting. That's fascinating. And you said earlier that you think that the mystical experience is essential to the therapeutic outcomes for the most part. Does that mean, like, what's your take on sort of these people that say that you can sort of remove the hallucinogenic properties and have sort of non-psychedelic psychedelics, for lack of a better word?
Right. So I'd clarify that the experience is central to treatment outcomes. The mystical experience is one particular type of experience, and I think it's a bit of a misnomer actually, but it's a defined experience in the literature. But in relation to all these companies that are looking into the psychoplastogens, I think is the new term. I think it's fantastic that people are doing this. I think that biology certainly plays a role. I think that if you can deliver a therapy that does not have any hallucinogenic effects and does not have to be in a supervised clinical environment, that's fantastic for scaling of these treatments. You can just give pills to people to take home, and I think there are many, many applications here. And you can also point to certain types of drugs where maybe the straight up physical component, the neurogenesis, plays a really key role apart from the experience, apart from the psychology. For the sake of example, you can maybe take ketamine as an example where there seems to be a mix where sometimes the experience does seem to be useful, but often it seems to just be the biology, and you can get some treatment results without the dissociative experience. So similar with the ketamine, esketamine, some of these other dissociatives, that's one situation in which you draw a distinction. But when you look at MDMA, for example, that is a situation where it's definitely not the biology. It's the inducement of a certain state and the application of a very particular protocol to that state that leads to the experience, that leads to the treatment outcomes. And so that's what we're focused on, those experiences, those so-called psychedelic effects that have a profound impact on the root causes of mental health disorders.
That makes sense. And as you sort of start engineering these new psychedelic experiences, do you think that the sort of therapy or the guide component and the integration component, does that have to vary with this type of psychedelic experience, you think?
Absolutely. It's a different type of protocol for every type of experience. There are probably opportunities to integrate virtual reality into some of these experiences, especially those that are a bit less intense, a bit more grounded. There are types of experiences where the patient is just gone. And so really all you need is some supervision to oversee any medical issues. And then there are experiences like the MDMA example where it tends to be a bit more interactive and interpersonal. So yeah, it's going to be different for each type of experience.
Gotcha. So I mean, obviously you're still sort of at the preclinical stage, but at some point you will have to figure out what the therapeutic protocols are that sort of surround these experiences.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about a new experience, there's a lot of work that goes into all the steps of the process. How do you first physiologically induce the state? And then how do you draw the connection between that state and the treatment outcome? And that's not always clear. It can be pretty difficult to first speculate and then test and prove out what those effects are, because it's often second order effects. It's not that something is happening that directly just makes you not depressed. It's that, for example, let's take a specific example. So a patient who has end of life anxiety due to a terminal cancer diagnosis, if they have this mystical experience where they experience the disintegration of the ego, the loss of the self construct, the experience that all is one, then they're addressing this existential anxiety that is at the root of the diagnosis, of the mental health diagnosis associated with that. And so it's sort of this second order type of thing, and trying to draw those connections will require a lot of clinical expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And teasing out what is the drug itself, what is the biology, what is like the therapy component, and then there's probably some other like X factors in there. It's certainly a challenge. Why do you think this is something I wanted to ask earlier? You mentioned in your intro that you felt that mental health drugs was sort of like the biggest unmet need, even compared to some of those other things you talked about. Why does it sort of feel like big pharma for a long time sort of ignored some of the mental health issues that we were facing? And like, why do you think that there's such a big unmet need for mental health solutions?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that Big Pharma ignored it, but Big Pharma definitely did divert resources away from mental health. So if you are one of these drug companies, then you're looking to make as big an impact for patients as possible. And if you look at all your mental health programs and they keep failing, then you're going to divert resources away from that into, say, oncology, where you can see more concrete near-term impacts. So I think the brain is just very complicated. It's difficult to find biomarkers. The epiphenomena here, the psychological issues, and the connection of those issues to the underlying biology is just extremely difficult to sort out. Um, and so that did drive, I think there was a 70% decrease in large pharma programs over roughly the past decade, and only in psychiatric disorders specifically. And it's only more recently that that's begun to pick up again.
And is that picked up almost entirely because of psychedelics, or
I don't think so. So
no?
in general, you don't see large pharma getting into psychedelics yet. There was a recent deal, a right of first refusal deal, very, very small, by one of the large pharmas. But I think in general, most of the investment that's picking up again has to do with other areas. Digital therapeutics play a role. Some biomarkers play a role. People are looking into the effect of the gut microbiome, gene therapy, some other areas. So in general, it's picking up, but I do see the psychedelic therapy modality as being something that will really drive the future of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. The biomarker thing is interesting. Is that something that MindState is working with as well, using biomarkers?
Not directly at this point. So ideally, yes, you have physical biomarkers for all of your outcomes, but that is it's just pretty difficult. It's fundamental science problems, fundamental science questions that need to be answered. And so we do feel that once we have this platform further developed, once we have all this data, once we've expanded the capabilities here, that we will have the ability to identify new biomarkers. But that's not the focus quite yet. The biomarkers, so to speak, are more the phenotypic biomarkers, the experience of the patient. So that's what we're
Yeah.
focused on.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, when you're talking about mental health, it seems like that is kind of the only thing that matters. Like if someone says that they're really depressed, it's like, well, whatever the biomarkers say, the person still says they're feeling very depressed. So you should probably like pay attention to that more than anything else. But it's interesting because I see a lot of pitch decks for startups that are like full on talking about biomarkers and brain wave readings and all this sort of thing. And I always ask them like, well, what if a person's subjective experience disagrees with what your like machine learning model predicts their subjective experience should be? And haven't gotten a lot of great answers to that question. So still kind of waiting to see where that goes.
Yeah, the biomarkers are fantastic, and if you can get them, that's great. But ultimately, machine learning models are going to fail. People are just very complicated, and so the point is to develop the model, to develop the biomarker to the point where that doesn't happen. And when it does happen, it means I don't know. It means you have to go back and revise your model, or it means that that's just not the patient population to focus on. But yeah, the biomarkers, especially in the mental health space, is a tricky subject.
Yeah. Now, I'm guessing that based on you're sort of trying to engineer these experiences. So does that mean that you're mostly going to be focused on these single large dose, experiential type therapies and not focused on the sort of microdose type psychedelic therapies?
So every program we consider completely independently. There's no philosophical commitment here. It's based on how does a particular state lead to a treatment outcome. So when you're talking about, say, MDMA type therapies, where the patient is entering a very profound entactogenic state, and that's being supervised, and there's a protocol, then yes, that's what we're going to be doing. We are not going to be doing any microdoses, so no subperceptual doses. But there may very well be cases where we develop therapies that are administered on more of a frequent basis, maybe therapies that can even be administered at home, where it's more of an MDMA-like experience as compared to a psilocybin-like experience, where it's more mid-level, the effects are more manageable, the physiological risks are low. And so each individual experience will assess it differently when it comes to the protocol.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you see just when you kind of step back and look at the industry? Are there any like interesting trends that you're sort of noticing, or I guess you started this over a year ago at this point. Like how has the industry sort of changed then from then to now?
It's There have definitely been a lot of changes. Very fast moving industry. From a regulatory perspective, you are seeing the continued liberalization of laws around all Schedule One compounds. So some cities, some states looking at decriminalizing or legalizing psychedelic therapies. Certainly, the continued legalization around cannabis has played a role, and there are these just changing societal attitudes to this whole area of altered states of consciousness and drugs that induce those. And so, I think with the changing attitudes, there have also come changing regulations, or at least attitudes among regulators towards these compounds. You've seen in the past year or so some pretty key late stage clinical readouts. So MAPS phase 3 interim trial data, the Compass phase 2b data on psilocybin, and those later stage readouts really provide a lot of it's additional evidence that's very important. So it's easy to point to small sample sizes and say that the outcomes are incredible, but those incredible outcomes tend to be reduced as you get to the later stage trials. And we're not seeing that in psychedelics. We're seeing continued amazing results in phase 2, phase 3. And so I think that has been really key. Certainly, you've seen an explosion in funding, in research centers being opened, in number of companies being started to commercialize various technologies here. It's been a really interesting time.
Yeah, and I mean, you have this biotech VC background, so you would know, but it also sort of feels like the types of investors that are getting involved in the space are very different from the types of investors that were kind of involved at the beginning. You know, at the beginning, it was like a bunch of Canadian gold miners, basically, and now and now, you know, you guys went through Y Combinator, which is very cool. And then I would imagine are the big biotech VCs getting more involved as well?
They're beginning to. So really, there are only a few that I know of. RA Capital certainly stands out, having made investments in a few psychedelics companies. In general, what I hear is that a lot of these traditional biotech VCs are watching the space. They're interested, but they're not quite ready to jump in. They need a little bit more late stage data. I think maybe the psilocybin data that came out recently may have changed some minds. But there are a lot of questions around IP. There are a lot of questions around the business model, the pricing, the ability to generate revenue using existing treatment models. And so some of these considerations, I think, have historically held those traditional investors back.
That makes sense. And when you look at the publicly traded psychedelics companies, there's an index that keeps track of them. And I think that index is down something like 70 or 80% from its all-time high, which was at the beginning of this year. What do you make of that? Is it just that there were a lot of low quality companies that IPO'd and now those are all being shaken out? Do you think that has any implications for the industry, or is that just sort of something, a temporary dip, setback to be pretty much ignored if you have a long-term view?
Yeah, I don't follow the public market indices very much. Sometimes I look at individual companies. So I know Compass, for example, the stock took a nosedive in the industry. In general, dipped a bit after the phase 2b data came out, which to me just didn't really make sense, and it signals that just unsophisticated investors were in these companies. And so I think in general, there's a lot of hype around psychedelics. And I expect, like with every industry, you're going to follow a pretty similar pattern of hype and then dealing with reality where things dip a bit. And then as the ultimate potential of the space is really emerging, and there's a bit of weeding out of the right quality companies, and I think you'll see things return and surpass their high, definitely.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, like you said, it's sort of that classic like Gartner hype cycle thing, and I guess we're in that like trough of disillusionment phase at the moment. But the fundamentals are still strong, I think, of like the underlying technology, which is the psychedelic experience. What was it like being part of Y Combinator as the only psychedelic company in the batch? Were people like trying to buy mushrooms from you, or like what was sort of the reaction from some of the other companies in your cohort?
Yeah, it was very positive. Being in that Bay Area ecosystem, there were just a lot of people who worked in unrelated areas, but
Hmm.
really cheered us on. In the Y Combinator system, when you go out on demo day, investors and internal YC people have the ability to click a couple buttons. And there's I think, a give love button, which is just cheer you on. There's a interested in investing button, and there's a interested in becoming a customer button. And our interested in becoming a customer button was clicked many times. Unfortunately, we can't make that a reality for a number of years here until FDA approval. But certainly a lot of interest in that space. A lot of creative people, a lot of tech people have seen the potential of psychedelics, either in the treatments of themselves or relatives, family, friends, or in just context of the betterment of well people, just increasing creativity and ideation and productivity as well. So lots of interest in the space, and it was fantastic to be a part of the community.
It's interesting that you mentioned the improving like creativity and productivity aspect of psychedelics. This is something that's obviously very popular in the Bay Area, as you mentioned. But unfortunately, like not being as creative as I would like to be isn't necessarily something that, the regulatory bodies sort of recognize as an indication that can be targeted. Do you think that there is like a legitimate path for, some Silicon Valley executive who says, I want to be more productive or creative, to actually go and, not in the underground market, actually get a psychedelic treatment that's targeted at enhancing creativity or productivity in the long run?
Yeah, I think, well, already there exist treatment centers that are legal or at least quasi-legal in other nations outside of the US, where you can go and get these types of therapies. I think if you're talking about within the US, what's important is to integrate these things with society, with culture in the proper way. And that wasn't done in the 60s, right? And I think that the proper path here is very much through the medical paradigm, where you do the testing to ensure the safety of these compounds, to really delineate what the risks are as well, so that you can mitigate those risks. And so, at least for us, our focus is completely on the medical side of things. It's completely on the development of these therapies. But I do think as society's attitudes continue to change, as people actually do experience these in a therapeutic context and their family and friends see the incredible outcomes, I do think you'll see continuing growth in public support for maybe the use of these outside of a therapeutic context. So there are religious contexts, there are, say, wellness or recreational contexts where maybe in the coming decades here, there can be some, I don't know, some form of licensing similar to how bars have alcohol licenses, where some of these experiences can be had at the lower level. And so it'll be very interesting to see what direction that goes in. And I am quite sure that we'll head in that direction. But for the moment, at least, our focus is completely on the medical paradigm.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see for sure. I got invited to something a while ago, which was it was like an experiential sort of ketamine session, and they had an actual doctor that you would have to do like a pre-screening with to get, prescribed ketamine, which you would then get at this experiential, like visual projection, breath work kind of thing, which I thought was very interesting because obviously there's plenty of underground stuff, but this was the first time I had ever seen a place that had like an actual physician giving someone a legal prescription for a compound to be taken in like a group experiential setting, which I was I did not attend this, by the way, but I saw the invitation and I was like, wow, this is maybe a sign of like what's to come. So it'll
Yeah,
definitely be interesting
absolutely.
to see what those things will end up looking like. But yeah, so that's like maybe a glimpse of the future. I think the productivity and creativity angle is like very interesting. Do you think that with what MindState is doing, is there room for, do you think that there are certain types of experiences that would lend themselves to, enhanced creativity and productivity? Or do you think that those are just natural byproducts of some of the existing states that we already get with things like psilocybin and MDMA?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are states that lend themselves specifically to creativity. and productivity. And the whole idea here is to figure out the matching of the state to the application. And certainly, many of those applications are going to be medical, and that's what we're focused on. But many of the applications, it's already clear to see that there's a creative or productive application. And some of that has been studied already. So there have been studies with creativity around psilocybin specifically, I think. And what we're looking for is some of this data to come out on psilocybin, on the first generation compounds, so that we can then link what is the aspect of the psilocybin experience that is particularly useful for depression, for creativity, for all of these different factors, so that we can then develop a particular drug, a particular protocol that calls out those specific experiential factors that leads to that particular state, whether it be the state that's best for creativity or depression or whatever.
Got it. Yeah, that's very cool, man. The future is going to be wild. So what's next for MindState? I know that, you guys might be hiring some people at some point in the future, but, what else is sort of like coming down the road for you guys?
Yeah, so definitely going to be focusing on building out the team here, bringing together a team of incredible individuals. We already have such a fantastic group. I'm really fortunate to be involved with these folks, but we're going to be adding to that team in the very near future. We're focusing, of course, on the mechanics of the business, so the intellectual property build out, pushing our lead program forward through preclinical studies into the clinic, building out the technology platform, the discovery platform here, and everything else that goes into pushing the business forward. So the ultimate goal here, maybe the 5-year timeline or so, is to have a catalog of altered states of consciousness, to have an underlying platform that provides the ability to selectively produce these different types of states, and to push forward as many of those as possible, either by developing them ourselves, by co-developing them or licensing them out to others, partnering with others, but to really be a platform that drives the exploration of this full range of altered states of consciousness that can be applied in medical settings.
I love it, man. It's a great vision. I don't know that I have any more questions for you, Dylan. Is there anything that you kind of wanted to touch on that we didn't get a chance to yet?
No, I think this has been great. Really appreciate you having me. I always love talking to you and look forward to talking again soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dylan. And where can people find you on the internet if they want to get in touch with you or, follow the journey?
Our website is mindstate.design. You can find me on Twitter at Dylan DiNardo, DILLANDINARDO.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dylan. I really appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks, Brom.